Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here for this YouthTruth webinar. Very excited to share this data with you and begin what we hope will be a long-term partnership in support of our youth and our schools. A couple of housekeeping notes about the format. First of all, we are in a webinar format, which I'm sure most of you are aware. And in that format, then you will be able to see the speakers and the panelists today, as well as the slide deck in the presentation, but we cannot see you. We will, however, be encouraging you throughout this webinar to please participate and engage by posting your questions and comments in the chat. In this way, your participation will help guide our conversation today. It'll deepen our engagement and understanding, as well as help us in planning next week's session, where we hope to really dig into some solutions with you all. I'm super excited to report that we have nearly 200 participants joining us today, representing a broad-based representation from our community-based organization, youth-serving organizations, elected officials, and of course, our school community, educators, and administration. From this, it's clear we are all concerned about Sonoma County's youth and the impact that the multiple years of our local disasters, perpetuated by the isolation experienced by our students in the pandemic, has greatly impacted our students' coping and learning. We're equally concerned about the impacts on our education ecosystem, and in particular with our educators and teachers. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the partnership that's made this project possible, and I will introduce today's speakers and panelists. First of all, I want to acknowledge the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, who first inspired a group of Bay Area funders to come together to form the Bay Area Student Voice Initiative, and to the Community Foundation of Sonoma County for inviting the CTE Foundation in 2017 to be their education partner to ensure the delivery of this youth survey tool throughout Sonoma County. To the Sonoma County Office of Education for helping us expand this effort from the original participation in 2017 with 2 high schools and 1,000 students participating, to this past year, we had more than 56 schools and over 18,000 students contributing to this survey. In the beginning, we set out to better understand the level of engagement our high school students were experiencing as it relates to ensuring their college and career readiness. Engagement has always been core to our mission at CTE Foundation, because we know that when students are deeply engaged in their learning, they see the relevance and connections to the world beyond school, which in turn leads to higher graduation rates, better student outcomes, as well as higher levels of completion in their post-secondary education choices. Like other Bay Area funders involved in this initiative, we believe that by lifting up the voices of our students and understanding their lived experiences, we will make better investment choices on their behalf. What we've learned, and you'll hear more about today, is how much the social emotional state of our students greatly impacts their ability to engage, connect, and learn. We all have a role to play in lifting up our youth so they can see a healthy, fulfilling future for themselves and in our community. We look forward to partnering with you all in this very important work. And right now I'm going to introduce today's panelists and get on with the show. So today we have Sonya Heister, who you'll be hearing a lot from today, who's going to do the data walk and help us better understand what it might mean and its implications. She's the Deputy Director with YouthTruth. We have Jessica Progulski, who is a big champion of students locally, of course, working in the College and Career Readiness Department at the Sonoma County Office of Education, and Karen Demarest, the Vice President for Community Impact with the Community Foundation Sonoma County. Behind the scenes today, we have a lot of support, including Amber Figueroa and Leslie Simmons with the CTE Foundation, Caitlin Childs with the Community Foundation, Sonoma County, and Jamie Hansen with the Sonoma County Office of Education. So now I'm going to turn it over to Karen, who will review a little bit about what to expect in today's agenda. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kathy, and thanks to everybody for being here. I think everybody should take a moment and take a look at the attendee list, because this is like the who's who of fabulous people in Sonoma County. So thank you so much to everybody for being here. It's really important. What we're going to be talking about is powerful, and I'm so grateful that we all care as much as we do to be here. So this is how it's going to work. Sonya, who is herself a Santa Rosa native and cares a lot about our community, she's going to do an equity data walk with us. And after certain sections of her presentation, we will all pop back on the screen and have a discussion about it. And at that point, that's when we're going to be able to elevate your questions. So be sure throughout you're communicating with us, sharing your ideas and questions in the chat. So we're going to see a lot of data, and we're going to encourage you today to use these 3 guiding questions. So what are you noticing about this data? What questions is the data raising for you? And then really most importantly, what can you do as an individual, as an organization about the data? That's what we're here for. So, just off the top of my head, I'm thinking you can, if you're a parent, you can advocate at your school board. If you're a community-based organization, maybe you're not youth serving, but you're probably serving adults then. So those adults are probably family members and parents. And so could you maybe reach out to the Hannah Institute and have them teach a class around trauma-informed care? That is one of the things that you can do, even if you don't see yourself in the youth lane, because this is all of our moment in time to step forward for our kids. The thing to know about today is that this data, it's hard. It's tough to see. And yes, there are bright spots, but we're focusing today on the data that's going to inspire us to act. So you're going to have your heart broken. We've had our heart broken, and we're going to do that together. And then the invitation is for all of us to link arms, to wrap ourselves around the kids and do what we can to help them to thrive, to grow, to heal, and to realize their greatest potential. So that's your invitation today, and the way we're inviting you to think about the data. I do want to recognize that Cradle to Career is also behind this effort. Cradle to Career, I have the honor of being the chair of Cradle to Career, as well as my work at the Community Foundation that I'm so grateful for. And this is a really important group that's doing, it's a cross sector. We have business, we have educators, we have nonprofits. All of us are coming together, and we have been for about 10 years to try to connect people with education, to elevate the important issues, and to amplify the need to support our kids. So if you have any interest about Cradle to Career, you can let me know. But right now, I want to turn it over to Sonya to get us started. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Karen and Kathy, for that fabulous introduction. It really is an incredible joy to share this time with you today. I am a Sonoma County native, but I also do help lead YouthTruth, which, just a quick introduction, we are a national nonprofit based out of San Francisco. We help school systems and foundations hear from their communities. We've been around for over a decade, and in that time helped elevate the voices of over 2 million students and stakeholders across 39 states and 5 countries. So we did a little bit of agenda setting at the start, and next up, I'm going to provide a little bit of a grounding framework and give a quick overview of our history together. Then we're going to do a ton of data dive. We're going to do a very, very deep data dive. I have 6 key areas of insight that I want to explore with you today. And as it was mentioned earlier, Karen, Kathy, and Jessica will help reflect on and discuss these findings too. Our areas of insight include what we're calling the fire and COVID effects. We'll touch on sentiments related to housing. Then we'll explore sense of belonging. We'll spend a bit of time on obstacles to learning, as there's a lot to unpack there, as well as themes of mental health and well-being. Finally, we'll learn what high school students have to say about their readiness for the future. I'll turn it back over to Kathy and Karen and Jessica at the end for additional Q&A and discussion, and they're going to share some ideas about where we go from here and how you can help. So with that, before looking at any data, I want to orient us to a framework that we at YouthTruth find exceptionally useful. This comes from the Racial Equity Institute's Groundwater Theory. We value this framework because it keeps us focused on the ecology of the whole community, and it cautions us against our tendency to blame or to focus on an individual problem. The groundwater theory rests on the metaphor of the fish in the pond. So here's how it goes. Bear with me for a little storytelling here. Imagine you have a pond in front of your house that you carefully tend to. Now imagine that you come out one morning and you notice that a single blue fish in the pond is floundering. In this instance, you might logically ask, what's wrong with this fish? Or if the pond were your local school, say, you might ask, what is wrong with this school? Now imagine that you come out the next morning and you find that all of the blue fish in your community are floundering. In this instance, you will likely intuitively shift your investigations to the health of the environment, because as we all know, you can't help the fish without tending to the water. So in this instance of our metaphorical pond, where one group of schools may be floundering, you might ask, might something in the system be causing unacceptable outcomes for these schools? So with this framing in mind, the Racial Equity Institute encourages us to ask the transformative groundwater question: how might our pond or our local schools be connected to the groundwater of the other systems around us? Each of us are connected to the groundwater of these schools and these students and these districts. So my question for you is, how are you going to take the data that you hear today? Because once you hear it and once you see it, you can't unsee it. So how will you take this data to strengthen the ecology of our beautiful community? That's our big question. All right. So with that question in mind, now let's give a quick tour of our work together. I'd like to frame this because, in order to unpack the current data that we're going to focus on today, we need to tell the story of the last 4 years. So it started as a simple pilot way back in 2017, gained steady momentum as we responded to emergent needs, amplifying the voices of more community members each subsequent year. So it was just 2 pilot high schools across 2 districts, gathering feedback from just 1,000 high school students. Then the devastating Tubbs, Nums, and Pocket fires hit the community. In year 2, it was definitely challenging to make the case that student surveys would be worth prioritizing when so many resources, understandably so, needed to go to fire recovery. Yet the work did expand, and 5 brave high schools across the 2 initial districts not only prioritized listening to student voices, but also gathered family and staff feedback, hearing from 5 times the number of respondents as the previous year. Then in October and November of 2019, we of course experienced the Kincaid fire. And with the growth of YouthTruth and the need for human-centered data to help inform fire recovery efforts, it made sense to use this existing survey platform to also ask questions about experiences and needs related to the local fires. So the YouthTruth team developed special questions for local student, family, and staff surveys. Just very quickly, our question development was informed by a review of the community resilience literature and disaster sociology, which frames questions about individual, family, and community impact, individual and community experience of crises, and assessment of highest needs. We're not going to be able to look at all of the data today, but that's just a quick overview of the types of questions that we did ask. So with these new resilience questions developed in year 3, 37 schools across 6 districts participated, resulting in feedback from over 16,000 community members. Then COVID happened. And in response to the move to emergency distance learning in March 2020, our team developed and nationally field tested special COVID-19 distance learning questions designed for students, families, and school staff. Last summer and fall, of course, we all experienced the devastating Glass Fire and LNU Lightning Complex fires, but the community has come together to listen and to learn. And in December and January of this academic year, through our standard surveys with the custom resilience questions and the COVID distance learning questions, 56 schools across 10 Sonoma County districts gathered nearly 30,000 community voices. Whew, it's been an exciting 4 years, to say the least. So it's these recent 30,000 voices that we're going to focus on today. Who's represented here? Nearly 20,000 students, representing 74% of the student bodies across those participating schools. Nearly 9,000 parents and guardians, representing 35%, and nearly 2,000 school staff, representing 86% of the school staff at those schools. Now, with all of that context and grounding, let's dive in to our first area of insight, the fires and the COVID effects. To set the stage for these findings, it's important to quantify the impact that the local fires and the pandemic have had on the Sonoma County community. So to do so, we will look at responses to two simple demographic questions that were asked at the end of the surveys. They are, think about your life lately. How much have the recent wildfires affected you? And how much has the COVID-19 pandemic affected you? The answers to these questions allow us to explore how respondents who are most affected by the fires and the pandemic responded to the survey themes and questions. Over half of all adults surveyed, 56% of school staff and 55% of families report being moderately or significantly affected by the Northern California fires. In contrast, 22% of students report moderate or significant impact by the fires. Not surprisingly, the majority of respondents across stakeholder groups indicate moderate or significant impact by the COVID-19 pandemic. 73% of school staff, 72% of families, and 57% of students report that the pandemic has meaningfully affected their lives. Now, I want to say those student numbers again. 22% of students are still meaningfully feeling the effects of the fires, and nearly 60% of students have been moderately or significantly affected by COVID-19. We'll see later in the presentation how the fire and COVID effects touch other aspects of student lives. With this understanding of the traumas in the environment, let's talk now about our second area of insight, which relates to housing. There's a long-standing housing crisis in the Northern Bay Area that you don't need me to tell you about. But since educators' abilities to stay in the community where they work is so important for student success, it's important to touch on the question of affordable housing. In the survey, families and school staff were asked if they thought that the community needed more affordable housing. The answer was a resounding yes. Nearly 80% of parents and guardians and nearly 90% of school staff agreed. More affordable housing could make a difference in teacher retention. Of the nearly 2,000 staff members who were surveyed, 35% said that they've seriously considered moving away from Sonoma County as a result of at least one local issue. The most frequently cited local issues are, of course, cost of living, wildfires, housing issues, and job availability. Now let's move on to our third area of insight before pausing for discussion. This next theme is about sense of belonging. Sense of belonging to one's school community and larger community is connected to other positive academic and life outcomes. When Sonoma County school staff were asked the degree to which they feel that they are a part of their broader community, the majority, 67%, agree or strongly agree. That same percentage of elementary students also agree, but a lower proportion of families, middle school students, and high school students report feelings of belonging to their community. Most striking is that just over 1 in 3 high school students, 37%, report feeling like a part of their community. Now, I want to put a spotlight on that high school student experience and narrow the theme from sense of belonging to the community at large to sense of belonging in a school's community. Because here we find that only 34% of Sonoma County high school students report feeling like a real part of their school's community. So let's linger here for a moment. This Sonoma County rating of about 1 in 3 high school students feeling like a part of their school's community is 10 percentage points lower than typical when compared to other high school students nationally that have been surveyed during the COVID-19 pandemic. While Sonoma County experiences do vary based on the COVID effect for other themes, this data suggests that possibly other local factors beyond the pandemic are contributing to a lack of sense of belonging in their schools' communities. Now, I've just done a lot of talking, and I really want to hear from the community leaders and from all of you in the chat and in this next phase of discussion. What do you make of these findings, and how does it connect to what you're observing in your community?
Thank you, Sonya. I really appreciate you sharing the groundwater theory, and it was so beautifully presented. And certainly here in Sonoma County, we can relate, and we have some experience. And on that note, first of all, I do want to encourage folks to start your questions now about any of the data that's already been presented. But Karen, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of that groundwater theory, how we might be applying it here on behalf of the Community Foundation, and taking that bird's eye view of Sonoma County and what we've experienced in terms of, rebounding and resilience from what we've experienced here.
Thanks, Kathy. I think that to me is one of the bright spots that we have as a community rallied together to, to come together, to rise up and support each other. And one of the things that I'd like to highlight, and there are so many, I mean, we at the Community Foundation, we have such an honor of being able to kind of see that broad view and support organizations that are providing mental health support, that are supporting arts education, environmental education, all things that are really important to lift up our youth. But one organization or effort that I want to highlight is the Sonoma Community Resilience Collaborative. And that is kind of stewarded by the Santa Rosa Community Health, but in partnership with many organizations. It is a collaborative effort. And at the heart of that is becoming a self-healing community. So the opportunity for people to get trained by the Center for Mind-Body Medicine in mindfulness practices, and then those folks who get trained get to bring the workshops and the learnings out to their community members. So I can be sure that their link gets in the chat. They have, you can request to have someone come in and provide training for you. It's very accessible, it's simple, and it really helps heal. Center for Mind-Body Medicine has done this all over the world for many, many years. And we're really grateful that we get to bring them into our community and for ourselves, take this training and give it back to each other. So that's one I'd like to highlight. Jessica, I'm wondering if what are you seeing in the schools? What are they doing, the schools doing in terms of building community?
Great question. And I can say in short, lots. There has been a real focus, even in my time and tenure at the County Office of Education, in terms of educators really prioritizing community building. My sort of bad and unspecific answer to your question, Karen, is that it's context dependent, it's community dependent. And so the most effective schools and districts that we see really endeavor to build community in the way that works best for their community. So they know who their community is and they respond in that way. But to be more specific, a couple examples come to mind, and they're certainly not exhaustive. But one approach is very relational. Schools like Dunbar Elementary and the Sonoma Valley Unified School District have worked really, really hard over several years now to build a sense of community, to engage in proactive community building restorative practices, to ensure that that's a foundation for their school and their school's community. Also sort of in the relational area, I know Roseland Schools as a district this year amidst distance learning really prioritized giving teachers time each day to ensure that they could reach out to families and to students as concerns related to the pandemic and to distance learning arose. There are, curricular examples too. I love to talk about that and could probably talk about that forever, but a couple examples of curricular responses to community building that come to mind lie sort of in the area of efficacy, We know sort of in the mental health world that feelings of efficacy over my destiny and being able to help solve some of the problems presented in my community are crucial. And so places that have really engaged in a lot of maker activities, hands-on collaborative efforts for students, working together to identify and solve and even prototype and build responses to their community issues. Being a little verbose, but CTE Foundation, I'm looking at Kathy here, really generously sponsored our organization's support of teachers working with students in distance learning with performance tasks, analogous to what happens in industry, where many of those involve students solving local community-based issues like feelings of isolation of themselves or even elders in their community. And then finally, there's even been some structural approaches to community building and to that sense of belonging. This year, for example, Rancho Cotati High School's response to the COVID pandemic and resulting distance learning was to go to a 3x3 schedule, which means, if you're not familiar, students still engage in 6 courses over the year, but they have 3 in the fall and 3 in the spring. And so really what they found is that being able to focus on fewer courses at a time really improved the ability for teachers and students to build relationships and to foster that sense of community and belonging. So lots of examples, more than I shared, but there are various ways that communities and educators are endeavoring to really foster relationships and community.
Well, once again, you're an amazing source of information, Jessica. Thank you so much. Great questions coming in the chat. We're trying to respond to some in the Q&A directly. We will continue to look at themes and come back to them, but I want to go back to Sonya now. Unless, Kathy, did you have anything else you were going to add here?
No, I was just going to help the transition because a lot of people are asking about the demographics. What do we know about the students in the survey? What we do know is not every student's experience is the same. And I think that's a good transition into the next segment of data from Sonya.
Thanks, Kathy. And just to quickly acknowledge that there is a full report of the findings that I'm sharing today that will be released at the end of this event, as well as access to aggregated data that do include in the appendix full demographic information. And then I've just thrown into the chat links to YouthTruth's design and methodology reports for student surveys, as well as family and staff. So for those of you who like to nerd out on survey design and statistics, those are for you. Happy reading. Let's move on to something that is a little bit less happy, which is obstacles to learning. I need to move my Q&A bar out of the way. So in the survey, we invite students to tell us whether there were any of the following obstacles that they were facing that made it hard for them to do their best in school. And what we see is that 64% of secondary students in Sonoma County did cite at least one of these obstacles. Now, I want to invite you to populate the chat with your guess of which of these obstacles you think our students selected more frequently than some of the others. I'll pause for a moment and see things come into the chat. What's your guess? Sarah says distractions at home. Jennifer, distractions at home. A few folks saying stress, depression. Yeah, it's been a year. And this connects to data that we saw from the spring. So for those of you who selected depression, stress, and anxiety, it is true that these do emerge as the most frequently cited obstacles, not just in Sonoma County, but nationally. So feeling depressed, stressed, or anxious does emerge as the most frequently cited obstacle, followed by distractions at home and family responsibilities. For our middle school students, we see that the third most frequently cited obstacle for them is limited or no internet access, whereas my health or the health of my family members ranks third among high school students. And not all students are having the same experiences, to Kathy's point earlier. When we disaggregate these findings by students' self-reported sexual orientation, we learn that a higher proportion of students who identify as bisexual, gay, lesbian, or in another way report that depression, stress, and anxiety are obstacles to their learning. So a higher proportion of these students who might already feel marginalized are facing this obstacle as compared to their straight peers. I'd like to pause here and invite any other questions from our panelists or the community. In particular, what are some of the resources for LGBTQI students in the community that we might want to highlight here?
Sonia, as we do that, I'm wondering, I just want to make sure I'm clear. The most recent data that you just showed us, specifically for this obstacle, the difference between students who identify as straight and those that identify as not straight, that was the most significant here in terms of differences, as opposed, for example, I'm thinking with other demographic factors like English language learner status or special education eligibility or race, ethnicity, gender. Was straight versus non-straight the greatest difference in terms of demographics?
Such a great question, Jessica. And that's exactly right. This is one of the segmentations that emerges as statistically significant. We'll also see that fire effect is also a statistically significant difference. In addition, and though it's not in the slides here, students who do not identify in the gender binary of male or female also report a greater sort of emotional load or burden here. So fantastic question.
Great. I'm seeing our community wisdom in the room. There are lots of things being sourced from the group in response to your question, Sonia, about resources locally. If we know this, what can we do about it?
Oh, that is so great.
Yeah, and I just want to point out again that that's exactly what we're here for. We're not here with the solutions. We're here as a community together to source the solutions. And that's going to be, just to plant the seed, the topic of our next meeting next Friday is really collecting all that information. So excellent to keep putting these ideas in the chat, and please join us again next Friday.
And thank you in particular to Sarah, I think, for pointing out that the obstacle is not one sexual identity or gender identity, but the bias and discrimination. That is the root cause, is the issue. Thank you, Sarah.
Yes.
All right, Sonia, should we go back to the data?
So let's talk about that fire effect. So we learned earlier that students are continuing to report that the fire is affecting them. And when we disaggregate by students' self-reported degree of impact, we see that while 41% of our middle school students who were really not at all impacted by the fire say that depression, stress, and anxiety is an obstacle, that number jumps to 58% for middle school students. Again, statistically significant difference here. And 77% of high school students who are most impacted by fires cite this obstacle, as compared to just 61% of high schoolers who were least impacted by the fires. Now, I also want to bring in the teacher perspective here too, because they have been facing a year just alongside all of their students. So as with students, the most frequently cited obstacle that teachers faced to online teaching is also feeling depressed, stressed, and anxious, with 68% of staff indicating this obstacle. Just over half of staff, 52%, say that family stress make it hard for them to do their best while teaching online. And this is followed by challenges using distance learning applications, which was selected by 46% of respondents. At this point, you may be wondering, and Jessica sort of alluded to this, with what other demographic segmentations could we look at here? And I do want to call out a note about the digital divide and how this has played out as an obstacle for some of our students too. And there is some inequity. So compared to their peers, a higher proportion of Sonoma County secondary students who report that they are taking classes to learn English. So those students in education are often tagged as ELL students or English language students. They cite that limited or no internet access or limited or no access to a computer or device is a meaningful obstacle to their learning. So we see here that 37% of students who are learning English say that lack of internet is getting in their way, versus 28% of their non-English language learning peers. And 1 in 4 students who are learning English say that lack of access to a computer or device is getting in the way, as compared to just 1 in 10 of our non-ELL students. And this is a good moment here to share that all YouthTruth surveys are available in both English and Spanish, where the respondent can toggle throughout. There's also text to speech available to be accessible for folks who may have struggle reading the text. So this data really does point to a bit of a digital divide based on this segmentation. Before we move into our next segment, I want to pause and invite our panelists to weigh in.
Sonya, we're getting a lot of questions, and I know it's throughout this report. We're seeing comparisons of how our students locally are impacted compared to nationally. Is there something specific here that you would draw attention to based on your knowledge and in comparison to what students are experiencing nationally and what's unique for our Sonoma County students?
Sure, great question, Kathy. And I would just say that the digital divide based on English language learners is actually a national problem. This is not something that Sonoma County has to solve alone. It's a challenge in school systems who we work with up and down California and throughout the United States. We see a similar statistically significant difference in our aggregate data. So this is one place where pulling on best practices and learning from other districts about what they are doing is a great place, because this is a challenge, back to the groundwater theory. This is a challenge that communities are facing nationally everywhere.
So I think that we're also seeing some themes in the Q&A around the sense of belonging and the impacts. How are we seeing the fire effects on the sense of belonging, on all the other data? Are we seeing a correlation between our students having been impacted by fires different than other students nationally?
Certainly, the fire impact, as noted in some of the data that I've shared and some of the other data that will be shared as a follow-up, continue to affect students' ability to do their work academically and think about their post-secondary plans.
Great.
So that's an excellent segue, I think, into the next piece of data, mental health and well-being. Ultimately leading into what we hope for all of our students, which is readiness out of high school.
Absolutely. So let's talk now about mental health and well-being. And nationally, we definitely know that America's youth are not doing well. Anxiety and depression were on the rise before the pandemic, and mental health related emergency department visits, for example, have only increased since the pandemic happened. So Sonoma County high school students have faced compounding traumas over the last 4 years, making the need to provide school and community-based emotional mental health support now so essential. Over the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about emotional and mental health findings, including data on thoughts of suicide. I recognize that this can be a difficult topic for many of us. If this is a trigger, you may want to take a break from the webinar for the next few minutes. Also, if you or someone you know needs help immediately, please call the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. We're going to put a number to call or text in the chat here below, and that resource is available to you. 43% of Sonoma County high school students say that they have experienced prolonged sadness. This is a little higher than typical when compared to California and nationally, where that number is 40%. When we disaggregate by grade level, we see that a higher proportion of our 11th and 12th grade students indicate this prolonged sadness. Do students feel like there are people at their school to connect with when they're feeling upset or stressed? Nationally and in California, less than half of high school students report that there is an adult from school who they can talk to when they're feeling upset, stressed, or having problems. That data is 45% and 43% respectively. So while this stark data point is already articulating a national need for more intervention and support for young people, in Sonoma County, we do see that less than 1 in 3 high school students, so this 32% here, say that there's an adult from school who they can talk to when they need it. In the next slide, we will touch on thoughts of suicide. And not all of it is bad news. So it's typical. Thoughts of suicide are about the same for students in Sonoma County versus in California and nationally, with 12% of high school students surveyed indicating that they've seriously considered attempting suicide in the last 12 months. However, that number rises for students who report being significantly impacted by fires and COVID-19. We see here that a greater proportion of students who are moderately or significantly impacted by the fires indicate serious thoughts of suicide. Similarly, a greater proportion of students who were significantly impacted by COVID-19 indicate serious thoughts of suicide. I recognize that that was heavy data. I'll pause. I do see that there's a lot in the chat that I am not able to manage all of, but we will try to get to those chat questions. And let's take a moment to pause and reflect here.
I just want to note that I mentioned that our hearts would be broken, and this is the place where our hearts break, and where we recognize that our youth need us. They need us as a community, and they need every single one of us. So this is what we know, this is what the students, they're telling us. That's the power of this data, is that it's coming from the students themselves. And those are the students who are willing to check that box on the survey. So if there's anything that motivates us to do all we can, if we're funders, nonprofit organizations, parents, this is what we know now. So what are you going to do? That's the question. Jessica or Kathy, do you have any thoughts or other questions that are rising up that we need to elevate?
I would love to invite folks in the chat to offer up really positive examples of support for students around mental health. I'll be a little redundant about this a couple times, in fact, throughout our time together today. We know that students can't learn unless they're ready. And there is so much work that schools have done, even SCO, in terms of hiring a whole behavioral health team in response to this genuine crisis. But we can't do it alone. And so today is really, as we said, an opportunity to look at the data and to get curious about it. But would love to hear from folks both today in the chat and those that will be joining us next week around really how can we take action and how can we ensure that educators don't feel alone in addressing this problem.
I'll just add one more thing just to really emphasize that point. As we work with our education system and our leaders, they really want to know the community supports them, that this is a wraparound opportunity. This is not just their problem to solve, because these issues and the stress that our students are feeling isn't just in school, right? It's the life around them. So very much appreciate the level of participation that we have from our community-based organizations, and know that there is a role for all of us, and it is welcome and will be embraced.
Appreciate lots of specific reaction and action both in the chat. One question actually for Sonya, and Sonya, I don't know that you're able to answer this. Do you know, because YouthTruth engages with students and youth primarily, do you know anything about the comparison of the rates of suicidal ideation in youth as compared with adults? That's one of the questions. I'm interpreting it to mean, is this higher than we would expect over the general population, or is it sort of in line with that?
Oh my gosh, that's such a great question. There are some fantastic great research that we've linked in the full report that everyone will have here. Research from the CDC and other organizations that definitely speak to this. Based on my own research, I do know that we are seeing suicide ideation on the rise. It is, I believe, the second leading cause of death for youth under the age of 20 in the United States, something along those lines. I don't know exactly how that compares with adults, which I realize is the actual question, but there's a great need there for sure.
Thank you.
And I see a lot of questions that are about disaggregating this data. And it was mentioned before, but I just want to say again that, and actually say it with a big thanks to all the school districts that participated in this survey because of their willingness to say, okay, this is data we want to share. It's not specific to a school district. It is an aggregate data set, but you're going to have links where you can really dive into this data, and all those links will be made available to you along with the PDF report that is highlighting the data that you're seeing today. But there's a lot of ways to pull this data apart, and you're going to have access to that through the links we'll be providing at the end of the webinar.
So just to reiterate, you'll be able to disaggregate to things like gender, grade level, race, ethnicity, things like that, but not to the school site level.
All right, back to you, Sonya.
All right, and the links to the aggregate reports, absolutely, they will be made available to everyone, and we encourage you to share them and link them on your websites. I apologize, I got kicked out of the webinar, and I need to reset my share settings here. Thanks for bearing with me. Okay. We've talked a lot about readiness and what comes next. So let's talk about that as a very specific theme, because we definitely know that the national high school graduation rate has historically been on the rise, but there's a big question in that. Do students feel prepared for what's next? And especially in this moment of a pandemic, are they prepared for what's next? So for Sonoma County students, what are they thinking about their plans for this very uncertain future? In the YouthTruth survey, we ask a pair of questions related to readiness for careers and readiness for college. I'm going to pause here and talk over, I know that there's a lot on this slide here. What we're looking at here is the degree to which students feel like their school is preparing them for the careers of their choice that match their interests and abilities and the careers that they want. And also, are their schools preparing them with the understanding of the steps that they need to take in order to apply to college and also be successful in college level classes. And here we do see that Sonoma County students do rate their feeling of preparation lower than typical when compared to their peers nationally. Connected to this, we want to think about sort of relevance of learning and the connection between what they're learning in class and their life outside of school. So just 32% of students say that what they learn in class helps them with life outside of school versus 45% nationally. And 53% of students say that the work that they do for their classes really makes them think. So slightly lower than typical when compared to our national numbers as well. We're coming up to high school graduations here pretty soon. The class of 2021 has had a high school experience like none other. So it wouldn't be fair to talk about this theme of preparation for the future without really looking at what kind of supports there are in the environment for the class of 2021 and how they're thinking and feeling about their futures. We know from our national data that 1 in 4 seniors, 24%, report that their post-secondary plans have changed since the start of the pandemic. In Sonoma County, the pivoting is even greater. 1 in 3, or 34% of Sonoma County seniors, say that their plans for what they will do after high school have changed since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And you're probably wondering, so what are they planning to do next then? Well, 2% are thinking about joining the military, 4% attending a trade or a technical school, 9% are going to just jump right into the workforce, 10%, none of the above, 12%, I'm totally not sure. 26% are thinking about attending a 2-year college, and 36% do want to attend a 4-year college. So this data is really interesting when we think about the context of COVID and how we're supporting our students for this very uncertain future in the very dwindling moments we have with them before they graduate, before they leave our K-12 school system. So hopefully the folks from Santa Rosa Junior College, Sonoma State, and other local and national universities can also think about what this data means for their school systems and how they will support and wrap their hands and arms around these students who are having to pivot like never before. So now we have a moment for pause and reflection. I know there's a ton coming into the chat.
Now, there's a lot coming in, Sonya. I want to comment on this section, and you talk about wrapping our arms around these students and helping them in this transition out of high school into what's next. And I just want to remind everyone of the project that we did here in Sonoma County to create the portrait of a graduate. And in that, it was really a way to talk to the community about what is it going to take? What are the skills and the attributes, experiences our students are going to need to be prepared for what's next, which will help them be more successful in college, career, and life. And I'm wondering, Jessica, if you just have a moment to talk a little bit about why those skills are so important and to focus on helping our young people develop some of those skills in terms of being fully ready.
One of my favorite things to talk about, Kathy, and I have so much gratitude to Community Foundation and CTE Foundation and YouthTruth from the bottom of my heart for doing such a great job in this report of making the case that things like relevance and engagement impact feelings of readiness and rigor and preparation. So I'm really excited to use this report in my own work. I think it has some huge utility value. But to directly answer your question, Kathy, we think a lot about, in my work and my team, about distinguishing eligibility from readiness. And as educators, we certainly in some cases do a good job of making students eligible for what's next. But we know that it takes a lot for them to be fully ready and to thrive when they get there. That includes, of course, many of the things outlined in the report, including opportunity to access relevant curriculum, opportunity to do work that adults in the world do, to solve problems that matter to them and their own community. But it also requires a tremendous amount of wraparound supports so that students are able to access and fully participate and engage in those learning experiences, and also, navigate sort of their path as adversity arises. One thing I want to say super fast is that so much of what the data that Sonya has offered today is validated through some local empathy interview work that we've had an opportunity as the County Office of Education to do in partnership with districts. And in particular, the college and career readiness section of this YouthTruth report mirrors so closely what we heard from students when we engaged in direct one-on-one conversation with them. There were several, in fact, 7 major themes that emerged from that work, but one of them was directly around feelings of really engagement, right, and motivation, and we heard things like, I'm feeling so stressed and anxious about my future, it's hard to be motivated. Or, I'm a high school student and there's no guarantee anymore about my future. And so some learning in school in general can feel really trivial. And I guess that shouldn't be a surprise to us, but the obvious answer from them about what we do about that was relevance. They said, I want to learn things now more than ever that matter to me, that have to do with my local community and that help me for what my plans are in the future. So, they told us directly, I think in the YouthTruth data, as well as through some more anecdotal work we've done locally.
And just one quick follow-up on that. I think it's also important. We talk a lot about, and I hear a lot of people ask questions and concern about the loss of learning during this period of pandemic. And even though there may be some sense of loss of some academic learning, there was a lot of learning going on, right? We know that in our own adult world. And to look at some of the skills and aspects that these students had to tap into really align, right, with some of those portrait skills. So I think where and how we can acknowledge that in our students, that there was a lot of growth and learning that will provide the skills that they need to just do life, right?
I think it's been so powerful, Kathy, to see the portrait outcomes developed, recently, but not this year, so much validated both from community and industry partners, but also in what students say their lives are like now. They feel even more real and validated and relevant, and can really be a springboard for us, I think, in terms of thinking about what we might do next.
That's really great. And I'm seeing, to that point, Kathy, I think sometimes when we think about supporting our youth, or we see surveys like this that are done in school, we kind of think it's the school's responsibility or academics are going to prepare them. And we forget about all of the other ways in which we become a well-rounded, holistic human being. And I saw something in the chat from Meg Hamill at California Poets in the Schools about the work that they do in the schools, helping children access their emotional experience through the writing of poetry. And I think as we consider how we're supporting kids, we expand that view to include the arts, to include getting outside and participating in sports, to really know that they need a lot, and it's not just the learning that happens through academics. So I think right now we're going to go ahead and switch to a Q&A session. And we're just, it's just amazing to see all of the fantastic ideas and resources that are coming through in the chat. And we'll definitely be, monitoring that. But I'd like to encourage people to go ahead and use the Q&A. You can even, repost from the chat into the Q&A. That'll be a little bit easier for us to facilitate from there. And Sonya, one of the things, if I could ask you to join us here, because a lot of these questions have to do with the data themselves. And while this data is incredibly robust and deep, it doesn't do everything. And so, we will ask a few questions from the Q&A, and the answer can always be, well, that's not part of what we do. So I'm just gonna, I don't know, Jessica or Kathy, do you have something that you see in the Q&A or in the chat that you'd like to pose as our first question?
I would, just because it comes right out of the readiness segment that we just did. Someone is asking about what opportunities are being presented or planned, or are we thinking about how we help students connect with careers. Of course, this is about thinking about their future, which they have a lot of anxiety about. That might be related to careers that come out of the pandemic or are shifting as a result of that. That could be part of that anxiety. I don't know, Jessica, if you have an answer to that, or.
I don't have an answer. I certainly have a lot of questions. And I think there is a real opportunity, and those that work closely with me will be tired of hearing me say this, but to do with students in this process. So before we design sort of a solution to anything, in this case, really career preparation, career exploration, it might be really good to not only survey our landscape, but to really understand our students through things like YouthTruth, right? In terms of helping them co-design with us some of those responses. But I think we do know that we are in education in general preparing students for an uncertain future. And they're more critically aware of that than we are, I think. And some of the best examples to that, or responses, I should say, to that specific question have come from students.
Great. And I see this question around, do we know what students, to the last section, Sonya, that you talked about, do we know what students' intentions, have they changed from to when they've changed their minds? Do we have any information about that?
We do. I'll make sure to highlight that as a flag for a place to look in the roll-up aggregate reports in the distance learning section. I didn't prepare slides on it. I'm trying to find that data on the fly, but there is some interesting data about how students are thinking about, what needs to happen differently for them. One of the things that we saw in our aggregate data is that many students who were previously planning to attend a 2 or 4 year college are really thinking about just taking a gap year. The investment in higher education is a significant one, especially if it's going to be all virtual. We're seeing this in other research and other news articles, of course, as well. And we do see that that's true in Sonoma County.
Sonya, I have another sort of logistical survey question. I think I know the answer, but you're definitely more expert here than me. There's a Q&A, a question in the Q&A in response to what felt like very disturbing information about mental health and the landscape of how our students are feeling. Can we determine if the students who felt impacted by fire and have considered suicide, if those are the same students who have been saying that they were moderately or significantly impacted by COVID? Do we know if there's any overlap between sort of fire effect and COVID effect?
We don't empirically know based on the analysis that we've done. We can make some conjecture though, based on the way that those segmentations show up in the report and the way that we know that those factors are both affecting students' thoughts of mental health and the barriers that they're facing.
Thank you.
Sonya, I think it would be valuable to, since we're going to be sharing these links and it's a lot of data, it might be helpful to just tell folks what they can expect from the links, what the data looks like, how they might use it. I mean, there's a great question here about can we have a goal of setting goals of how we can increase these metrics? Like how are we going to know if we increase by 5%? Is that going to mean anything? Is that attainable? Or is that too small of a desired increase, depending on what we're addressing? So it would be helpful to get a sense of how to walk through and use this data. And then the question remaining, can we set metrics? Can we, as a community, can we set goals of how are we gonna move these data points?
I love that question, Karen, and it's such a great segue for something that I did not prepare to talk about, because this is something we go deep into with all of our school people, but it is so fun to be able to go here with this broad community. There is a link on the YouthTruth website that I'm just going to share my screen to. It's youthtruthsurvey.org/backpack. This is a digital resource backpack, and this is a one-stop shop for really thinking about, how do I understand the data that I'm looking at? How do I make meaning of these findings? Goal setting matrices that are great. There's wonderful templates and protocols for thinking about, how do I connect this YouthTruth data to goals that I have in my community? So these are fantastic resources for you. Planning for improvement. This is also a really fun section of resources where, as you're going through the YouthTruth data, because there are a number of items across our elementary, secondary student surveys across these core themes that tie back to the research around what matters most. Let's say we're looking at the high school survey data, and we're looking at some of the data that we've looked at earlier in our presentation today about, the work that I do for my classes really makes me think. Let's say we got low ratings in response to that question. Here is a research-based protocol that we've curated for you that relates directly back to this question that you can use with your community to think about how to better engage students. Now, keep in mind, these are designed for our school audience, and so that's the place where we do that's where YouthTruth does most of our intervention work, is within the school environment. But these are wonderful tools for the community to use as well. I put the link to this in the chat, youthTruthSurvey.org/backpack. Tons of really great stuff. So definitely take advantage of these resources to really unpack the data, localize it, and think about what kind of change you'd like to help create within your community based on these findings.
I am so glad we got there, Sonya. That was really important. Thank you so much. And I think it would be really helpful also to say, this is unique. We've been doing the survey locally for many years, as you pointed out in the beginning, but this moment in time in terms of sharing it with the community is the first time we've done it. So I think it would be helpful to share what has been happening with the data prior to bringing it to the community. I mean, this is really all about informing the schools. So if you could give a little insight into what the schools do with the data.
Sure, and I'll speak quickly to some of the resources in the backpack. So across the 10 different districts, there's always a practice of unpacking the data locally. What are some of the bright spots? What are the priorities for change? How do I connect that to my LCAP? How do I connect that to my school site plan? So all of that is happening. I will not speak for the schools in your community. I really want to provide them an opportunity to share out and to share back. But I can tell you that the Sonoma County educators are doing an incredible job really internalizing and leaning into this data with empathy and curiosity and care. I mean, it is unusual in our work with school districts across 39 states for there to be a willingness to share the data out broadly in this aggregated way and invite community inquiry in this way. So I really applaud all of our principals, teachers, district administrators who have participated and who continue to say, I can't do this alone. And of course, this data is important and student voice matters. It's at the center of our work and we're taking it very seriously. So there's the empathy interview work that SCO has been leading that has been influencing a lot of this. There are student-led conversations that are happening, resources in the backpack around how to facilitate a student voice workshop. Those resources are available. So some schools are engaging. They're inviting students as young as 3rd grade to say, hey, we noticed this data. What do you, 3rd, 4th, 5th grader make of this? 6th, 7th, 8th grader, what recommendations do you have for how I can better support you in these strange times? We know in both the YouthTruth Sonoma County data and in our aggregate and our national data that relationships with teachers have increased markedly during the pandemic. There is an incredible intervening that has been happening on behalf of educators to connect with students, to meet them where they're at. And so when we look specifically at our relationships With teachers' data, we do see some really beautiful bright spots locally and nationally that should be celebrated, and we should really applaud our educators for the way that they're showing up.
Sonia, thank you. I think that addresses a couple of the questions and statements, in fact, that appear in the question and answer section. Lots around sort of what I'm characterizing as schools can't do this alone. And I really hope that between these two sessions that we'll be hosting and facilitating, that there's an opportunity to think specifically about how community-based organizations and youth-serving organizations can support the schools in their next steps. I'll also say, I guess, as a little bit of a teaser, that you teed up nicely, Sonia, that we'll have the opportunity to invite and actually hear from some educators about where they're at in terms of their phases of YouthTruth action, and some more specific local examples about what could be done with the data and what asks remain. The questions that we don't know how to answer, and that will be specifically with our youth serving organizations next week.
I agree with that, Jessica. And again, I also think how wonderful it is that you got to share the backpack with us. And I think I'm envisioning now our community organizations coming together and creating our backpack, right, of tools and resources in ways in which we can support our schools, our educators, and our youth.
Yep, and I see a question a question that the data raises is around the methods that students are using for coping, and have we seen an increase in alcohol and other drug use among students, and how can we help students build protective factors? That is a question for our entire community, but I don't know if anyone of the panelists has resources or ideas on how to answer that question.
Or I'll defer it back to, I know we're in webinar format, but defer it back to the chat too. With so much wisdom in this virtual room, surely there are bright spots of where that's happening well, or ideas for how it can. So, folks participating today, help us answer or address the question that Karen elevated.
And Sonia, I'm wondering, do you capture information about drug use, drug or alcohol use in the data?
Great question. We have a module. We have a set of questions that can be added about drug and alcohol use. Only a subset of the Sonoma County districts have administered those questions. So we don't have comprehensive countywide data about that to speak to drug or alcohol use. I know that there are other proxy measures to look at this. There's also the California Healthy Kids survey data that historically has been collected every other year from 7th, 9th, and 11th graders, I believe it is. But that is an opportunity as we think to next year. If we really want to get more data around those specific items, we can make sure, especially as we can maybe pull back, hopefully, from having to ask as many questions about local environmental disasters, maybe we can go a little bit deeper in some other areas of inquiry and include them in future surveys. There is a question in the some data in our emotional and mental health section that does ask students if they are finding ways to cope. And I don't have the data right in front of me right now, but I can say that anecdotally, I did see that Sonoma County students do often have ways of coping when they're feeling depressed, stressed, or having problems. Additionally, many students, a reasonably high proportion of students, are seeking support from a mental health counselor. That's a good segue to mention that there's a huge opportunity to fund more mental health support systems in schools. The counselor to student ratio is something like 1 to 470 nationally. And so we really have this national opportunity to bring in more resources to support students. So it's not on the beholden on the parent always to fund private mental health support if it's not available as much locally. And I know that there are other youth serving organizations that are doing some great work here too.
Mm-hmm. There's an interesting question about the correlation between students' decreased desire, an interest for post-secondary education, and the current social justice climate. Is there any social justice data or anything that you're seeing nationally in terms of tracking something like that?
Yeah, so we don't do correlative analysis in our surveys. We're just mostly sharing out descriptive statistics in response to individual questions and themes. This is a really interesting question to us, though, and I don't have specific data to answer it.
Sonia, I think that this is a good time probably to point out that I think based on the quality and quantity of questions that folks are offering, that we are curious about this data, that it has piqued something for us. And within our more local communities, either that reside in or around the school communities, there is absolutely an invitation to follow up and seek more information about those things that we're curious. I would love to see, for example, a school community with community partners and families interrogate sort of the YouthTruth data with a social justice lens and go out and engage. Maybe it's in some empathy work or in some student shadowing, or as you mentioned, Sonia, some student voice work. I don't think we have to. I think the YouthTruth data is incredible, and hopefully it mobilizes us to go find out more. Because right, like this data isn't the answer. We certainly don't know what it's like personally to be a student in Sonoma County, but we can definitely get curious based on what they've told us. And I think that's a great potential action step that we can discuss moving forward.
I think also to recognize that we're talking about aggregated data across the county.
Right.
And individual districts and schools will have the ability to work within their data set and do maybe some of this cross correlation and further digging, and hopefully be able to embrace organizations and a support network around the issues and the solutions very specific to their student population.
Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah, and one theme that I'm seeing in the chat is around supporting the adults that are supporting youth. And that includes parents and teachers who are themselves struggling, and parents who have been doing trying to do school at home and their own work. A lot of struggle there, and this is a real equity issue as well. And we know that our families that cannot, low-income families, they are struggling, and so we need to really think about how we are supporting the parents and the teachers. We were recently talking about, how can we ask our business community to step forward and provide childcare resources so people can get their kids to school. The situation right now with 2 days a week in school is really challenging for parents who are working. So what are we doing? How are we stretching the limits of the way we think about this in order to really provide the support necessary to the parents and teachers so that they can then support the youth? So that's another way for all of us to be thinking about this. All right, I think, as much as we could keep talking about it, I think you really use an extra time to dive into the data. We're gonna put links here into the chat. We do have, again, a report that is a beautiful report, and the links. So take this time, take these few minutes while it's still fresh to look at it and really think about, what does this data inspire you to do? So Jessica, I'm gonna hand it to you.
Lovely. Super grateful with all my heart to the individuals across our community who joined us today. There is too little time to share so much of the rich data found in the YouthTruth report. And we're definitely here to help you access and make sense of that as possible. As I said previously, today was really about accessing and getting curious about the data. If any one of us had the answer, we would have done it already, right? We would have solved that. And so what we hope to do next, and in particular the youth serving organizations who will be present next week, will really look at what can we do individually and collectively to take seriously these students' voices and to take action around it in a meaningful way. One thing that I would love to sort of preview in terms of what might be a springboard for us next week as a community is to think about the connection between belonging and community, and how those are, as we know, from sort of the trauma-informed world and from the adverse childhood experiences work, we've seen a little bit of some bright spots there. It's not where we'd like, students to feel in terms of belongingness and community, but it's actually on the rise in Sonoma County. And in spite of several instances of recent adversity in our community. And since we know that those things, belonging and community, are core protective factors against the impact of adversity on our physical, mental, behavioral health, how can we leverage building community and increasing sense of belonging in order to mitigate some of the effects and impact of some of the areas of concern that emerge from this report? I'm thinking in particular about the educational landscape even, and how we might, moving forward, really think about using intentional efforts towards building community and increasing a sense of belonging in order to increase engagement and learning. So there's sort of a phrase within education that implies that relationships are a requisite for rigor. And so what can we do to ensure that our students are genuinely ready and thriving, and that we know who they are so that we can build relevant learning experiences for them? So that's just my sort of metacognitive dump in terms of what I'm thinking as an educator moving forward. But we're really eager to crowdsource from this community, from the wisdom in this group, the very best ways that we can tell the students we've heard them and we're going to do better by them.
Mm-hmm. So important, Jessica. We heard them. We say in philanthropy, do nothing about me without me. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. Do nothing about the students without their feedback and without their participation in the solutions. So thank you so much. It's been such an honor to be here, to see all the amazing ideas that are coming. Really, when we come back on next Friday, it is about collecting all of our collective wisdom and what are we going to do. So Kathy, I'm going to hand it to you to close us out.
Thank you so much. And, Jessica, there's a reason we asked you to do that close in an inspiring way. The recognition that we have to see students where they are and for who they are just says so much. So I know we've kind of talked about, what are the bright spots? Are there any silver linings in this data? Because it is so heavy and really breaks our heart in so many ways. But I just want to acknowledge again, the community that is here today. The participation we have, the schools, the districts who kept coming back and stepping up, even crisis after crisis, continuing to push forward and conduct the surveys. The fact that we have 74 to 86% response rates. I mean, my background is in marketing. I mean, you would just die to have those kind of response rates in a survey. So the students, the parents, the education community for providing such rich data. I only hope that we can honor that and your feedback as a community the way we have done so many times before here in Sonoma County. So please plan to join us next week. You'll be hearing more about that. Let's dig in and let's
I want to say one more thing. We have to thank Sonya.
Yes, I was thinking the same thing.
Yes, Sonya, come back. You are amazing. When you see this report, this is Sonya. When you look at that report, it is her. She has done so much for our community and is just brilliant and wonderful to work with. So thank you so much, Sonya, for taking us through that data with such a compassionate and thoughtful manner. We're really grateful to you.
Absolutely. Thank you all.